if you go over time.
Okay. So I'm going to time myself because I didn't quite time out how much I had put. Half our panel is not here.
Well, Grant's out there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And Ray's here too.
Oh, okay.
So they're
just hanging out. Okay. That's up there.
Emily coming tonight?
No. She's got her own event.
For their
gala.
Oh, that's tonight. Oh, that's
For the
good.
APL. Yeah. That was one where everyone made plans way ahead of time, including
How it goes.
Same thing. Oh no, there's a lot of things going on. What is what's the charter school out by Countryside?
I don't know.
Oh shoot. Well, anyway, its 25th anniversary celebrations is tonight.
Oh wow.
So, yeah, all sorts of stuff going on.
Those people who hang out there in the, like up there, you see these balcony dwellers. That's where I go on the pre-opening conference. Like back up there near the door, and after about a half hour, I can't stand it anymore. I just leave.
Oh, that's smart.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, your leaving isn't nearly as noticeable. I just can't.
Yeah, you don't want to be the one that makes the scene.
I mean, it's not even about education anymore. It's about whatever.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have much to do with the faculty. Hey, well,
You're talking about Stanford or?
oh no, well that's true.
Well, that's
No,
true.
the opening conference.
Pre-opening conference.
It's basically introduction to new administrators. That turns out to be.
Oh, the introductions. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, because this goes on. It's like, come on,
Forever.
I'm busy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, it's long.
Oh. So, 10 minutes on the short side, 15 at the long. So that's why I said 13.
And what order?
I don't care. What order do you have a preference?
I'll go first.
All right.
You
You got it.
Well,
But I'm going to start clearing my throat at 13 minutes.
that's all right. That's all right. I have
Should
no
have a
prepared
shepherd.
I got to throw.
I was going to say shepherd staff.
Yeah, I've got
like the old
crumpled
Looney
up a few
Tunes.
pieces of paper. It's like Father Canavan used to do. He set the timer. You
Oh,
ever
you
see him
told
on
me
a
about
panel?
this.
Who?
Father Canavan. He'd put like one of those egg timers that would go bzzz, and he would just let it go. He'd just let it go, and then the person would sort of, humiliated, would sort of hunker back to their chair. Oh yeah. It's great.
So, who do we have as national dinner speaker?
Clifford Humphrey. Larry's, I think, is going to come. It's not clear whether he'll stick around. He may say a few words. He's recovering from a medical procedure.
Oh, back?
So, yeah, having to do with his back, and they think, that he should recover, fully, apparently.
So 4 minutes has been in.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, you have to ask him about what it was. I mean, but he was at Mayo Clinic and had a procedure, but apparently the prognosis is very good. And he's like, yeah, so he just got back today or yesterday. Oh yeah, but I said, stay home. What's wrong with you? And no, I'll calm down. He can't do it. He won't listen.
He can't control himself.
No, of course not. Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Oh, is Larry going to come to this thing?
Rumor has it that he will. No. He can see us anytime. Rumor has it he's going to put in an appearance.
If it was like the big donor event, he might come in to meetings and people might make some sense. But he can, like you said, he can see anybody here almost any time. So
Yeah, right. One telephone call. Porteous is in your office
Yes.
saying, yes, sir. Well, I better find a seat.
Go from one thing to the other.
So I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes on the short side. If you go over, 15 is probably like the totally outer limit.
yeah,
I'll just start.
I'm usually pretty good about that, but
Need the lights.
So Ray's wants to go for. The problem is the lights. You mean these Cleveland?
No, I mean the red light, green light on.
Oh
on-
yeah, I don't know if that works.
I did a free market for the Folsoms, and
Oh.
they had that set
Because
up
of
on.
Anita, because she's a fanatic. That's Anita.
Well, it's funny because I was the only person who paid any attention to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing.
The
It
other
only
thing is,
works if
you
you're
know-
trying to, yeah.
He's going first. Who's going next? What's
Whatever.
the order? Who's hitting cleanup? Let's start with that.
Age before beauty.
Okay, so we'll go declining age. You.
No, I'm older.
I would be last if you did age.
All right, that's what we'll do.
All right.
Okay.
Arbitrary fashion.
Start us off.
Are these glasses set for us, or are they left over from the last panel? Or?
I sneezed in one. I mean, I don't
Okay.
know. No,
Just-
I have no
just
idea.
get- It's like the which one's poison.
This goes, no, an hour and a half. So, okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our faculty panel. I was very specific with my faculty colleagues about what I wanted out of them at this panel. I said something like, you know, statesmanship, things that are going on. That's about it. You know, I wanted to give them a chance, or actually I wanted to give you guys a chance to hear from some of the faculty on, you know, the issues of the day, and then hopefully we'll have some time, not hopefully, we will if I do my job, we'll have time at the end and just, you know, I want you guys to be thinking of some good questions to get going. We'll have at least a half an hour of that. So I don't think any of these men need an introduction. We're going to begin with Dr. Ray. We decided to go in reverse order, in order of age, oldest to youngest. So Dr. Ray, sorry, Paul, Dr. Grant, then Dr. Porteous, and Dr. Carrington. So without further ado, Dr. Ray.
What he really means is age before beauty.
Something like that. And can you hear him from that?
Can you hear me?
Okay. So make sure he's talking to it.
Okay. In chapter 6 of The Prince, where Machiavelli talks about the men of greatest virtue, he mentions that there's one requirement in addition to certain qualities, moxie, and that requirement is an occasione, an opportunity. I want to suggest to you that what usually constitutes an opportunity is a disaster, and that opens up the possibility of real statesmanship on a fairly grand scale. It seems to me that's our situation right now. We have been badly governed for some time in different ways. We've not had a fiscally responsible president since Dwight David Eisenhower. And we're now in a situation where the deficit is such that one begins to wonder whether our currency will hold up. And of course, if we cease to be the international currency, it would collapse because all those dollars would come back home. That's one problem. The second problem is we've been badly governed in foreign policy for at least the last 30 years. That is to say, our presidents from both parties have operated on the basis of a presumption that there will be war no more, and that what the first George Bush called the New World Political Order will prevail, and that political order will be largely commercial. We have averted our gaze from what was going on in Russia, and even more important, maybe by 1,000-fold, we've averted our gaze from what was going on in China. We are now in trouble. We're in trouble fiscally. We are in trouble in terms of foreign affairs. There may be a war, and we may lose it. The third problem is the administrative state has grown to such a level that we are no longer governed by elected representatives. Congress has no power, no influence, no desire to exercise power, and everything is done through rulemaking. And of course, the crazies are now in charge. The good news is that's produced a great deal of discontent. And that means there might be an opening for someone who would deal with all of these problems. Now, I say someone, that would require a president, of course, but not just a president, it would require a political party. Because when you have a crisis in the United States, as we did, for example, in 1860, the crucial question is there a political party with the backbone to do anything about it? Now, whether that's the case, I don't know. I will say this. There's no way that Donald Trump is up to this. He's too old. He's too undisciplined. And he sees part of it, but not all of it. It strikes me that there's a possibility that Ron DeSantis might be up to it. I doubt that there's any other Republican out there with the backbone, the intelligence, the understanding about how to govern who could do this. So though there is an opening for statesmanship, it's not clear at all that there will be statesmanship. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Can you? Yeah. Okay. There we go. I'm mostly going to talk about, what was it? We were asked to talk about prospects for statesmanship in the future, and I'm especially going to talk about the challenges for a future statesman in relation to foreign policy. Not so much talking about, say, China or whatever, which is important, but lots of people do that. But more the intellectual framework a statesman is going to be walking into, no matter who that person is. I'll say a few things, I think, at the end on sort of practical issues. And so the big, one way to conceive of the way we approach foreign policy in this country, or have approached foreign policy for at least about 80 years, is the question, are we going to attempt to manage the affairs of the world or not? And since 1941, I would say on, we have chosen to attempt to at least manage those affairs. And I'm thinking of the goals of the Atlantic Charter, which are to bring about the 4 freedoms everywhere in the world. And of course, if you want to produce freedom of religion and freedom of speech, which actually are the two we don't seem very concerned about and so much, but especially freedom from fear and want, you have to manage the domestic affairs of these. The line between domestic and international has to blur. Because, of course, if you want to get rid of want, then you have to have a world economy that really doesn't differentiate, does not distinguish between domestic and foreign. And of course, as you go on, from the original sort of New Deal conception, you take on the goals of the day. And so, most recently this last week, the White House furiously denouncing Uganda's take on gay rights, because that's something America needs to be. They had an anti-gay rights bill passed, or is going to pass, or something in Uganda. I really don't care. I don't live in Uganda, but the White House cares a lot about this, And so, of course, FDR did not care about gay rights in Uganda or anywhere else, but here we are. One of the biggest problems with this shift is we've done all of this thoughtlessly, meaning we have not built a coherent system to replace the earlier, what's often called Westphalian system. And so just some examples of where this plays out. The new, post-1941 system both affirms and denies the sovereignty of nation states. So, you can look at a basic document like the UN Charter of Human Rights, and it will tell you nation states are sovereign and also outline conditions when you can violate that sovereignty. We call it now right to protect, and that's a relatively new doctrine in that formulation, but it's been around for quite some time. Predecessor doctrines going back, at least from what I can discover, to the Stimson Doctrine of 1932, which denied the legitimacy of territorial acquisitions gained by aggression on the part of the Japanese in that instance. Well, and whatever the particulars of that case, it was very novel to say, you can't have a world of sovereign nation states if you have some nations which can judge the actions of others in that way, not respond to them as a matter of self-defense or something like that, but you know, Manchuria had nothing to do with our self-defense unless you really try and come up with a, I don't know, Curtis Yarvin style 100,000-word blog post explaining the U.S.'s vital interest in Manchuria, but I'm sure people will do that or have done that. You know, Japan's not an equal nation to the U.S. in that case, or you can insert the name, and what we don't like. It's the question, who judges, you know, qui judicavit, that's the juridical question, who judges. And if you, one of the basic precepts of the older system was that there are no, there's God and the laws of nature he makes, and under that, they're independent sovereign nations. And this new system, you can't really have that, although you still have national sovereignty, you know, so. And so all aggressive war, which seems to mean, trying to figure out what does this mean in aggressive war? I mean, as if there's non-aggressive war. I mean, you could say self-defense or something like that. But all aggressive war seems to mean, from what I can discern, when one nation's army crosses another nation's borders first. And that's deemed illicit in this order. The problem with this, I mean, there's things to like about this. Well, wouldn't it be good if you didn't have, you know, the loss of life, the destabilizing effects of these invasions? It doesn't take account of the movement of peoples, mass immigration. So borders can't move in the post-1945 world, except when they can, because we, you know, the creation of Israel, the creation of Kosovo, South Sudan, things we think are good. The royal we there. It doesn't take account of what we now call color revolutions. Well, is it violating a nation's sovereignty to initiate a change in government there? It seems, in the older system, yeah, that would have done that, right? So, what about, you know, color revolutions or subversion by foreign countries? What about economic domination? You know, and this raises some serious questions. We like to promote states that can't really be independent in any meaningful way. You know, Montenegro, Croatia, Macedonia, these are not real countries in the sense of they can't make a day of it. You know, we come back to Machiavelli on their own. They can't in this world, and tend to be dependencies on others. Well, so what does that mean? Well, just as long as you don't have an invasion in some sense, it seems to be okay. The criminalization of so-called aggressive war contradicts the old doctrines of justice in war and tends to nullify it in practice. If your opponent is a criminal, why would you treat him as an equal, honorable opponent? Is why you wouldn't do that. The extension of legal combatant status to insurgents, who are actual criminals in the older, you know, law of war, further muddies the waters. That's all post-World War II innovations. The Westphalian system's elaborate and generally very successful attempts to bracket war, in other words, to separate the political leadership and civilian populace from participation in warfare, meaning they're not fighting or subject to being aimed at intentionally by another nation's armed forces, has been utterly undone in the last 80 or so years. Now civilians are the direct subjects of almost all war making, subjected to being bombed or shot, or at least subject to measures compelling them to change their hearts and minds, as we used to say. But we go on and on about rules of engagement, and in the U.S. at least have a vast bureaucratic apparatus to oversee these efforts, staffed by luminaries like David French and Ron DeSantis at various points. I look forward to that coming out in the presidential campaign, you know, with DeSantis. That'll be interesting. What he learned, his time in Guantanamo Bay, or helping approve targets for special forces in Syria. The huge bureaucracy does nothing to alter the fact that war making is explicitly directed at the whole populace as a matter of course. Now you have you know, leading American officials, including presidents, openly speaking about how we are in Syria to take Syrian oil, which formerly would have been a big no-no in international law. Another far-reaching consequence of the new system is that neutrality, like sovereignty, is theoretically possible but contradicted by the general orientation of the system. How can you be neutral in a contest between good and evil? Jettisoning the old idea of just enemy, which means your opponent in war may be killed while following the laws of war, but he is your moral and legal equal and not a criminal, means neutrality is impossible. This is sort of, I like to call this the Marvel Cinematic Universe way of there's always a Thanos, and of course, whatever you do to stop these maniacs is good then, right? could also consider the bizarre idea that a nation can be a neutral or at least a non-combatant while supplying arms, training, salaries, and pensions, and targeting information to one side while applying economic sanctions to the other party, current disposition toward Ukraine. The idea seems to be we aren't invading Russia, so we're not a combatant. I mean, okay. You might ask, why is all this a problem? Well, I would say because statesmen are not philosophers. Statesmen are greatly aided by working within a framework that is coherent, reasonable, at least in terms of bounded rationality, and that in general will promote goods common to the whole people. An example that comes to mind is Lincoln, who inherited principles, including an understanding of the law of nations that was good and useful to him. He didn't come up with it on his own. He didn't have to operate with an incoherent view of justice at home and abroad. This turn to the Marvel Cinematic Universe view of human events, founded on a narrative about World War II, means you can't have the Constitution, which was designed for a Westphalian world, more specifically for a self-governing people dedicated to perfecting and preserving liberty at home. This meant securing our rights while respecting the rights of others. It also disallowed the kind of imperialism we practiced since at least 1900 and definitely since, as I mentioned, 1941. We have some other, I mentioned real quickly, practical difficulties. And Dr. Ray alluded to some of the, an incompetent elite. And so if you look at, even at the beginnings of this system, you had policy practitioners of the rank of George Kennan or Robert Murphy, who's got a great book called Diplomat Among Warriors. You know, he's a very smart man. We don't have that. We have CIA lactation rooms and these people LARPing as Metternich in pantsuits. You know, it's embarrassing. We have, you know, when Mike Pence was here, I learned much to my, he believes we're an arsenal of democracy. I mean, if you guys know anything about our industrial capacity, including to make weapons of war, we are very, very, very far from the capabilities we had when we were originally the so-called arsenal of democracy. I'm happy to talk about examples in the Q&A if anybody wants them. A future statesman's also going to have to deal with a physically and mentally unfit populace, much of it no use for war or for work. About 25% of young people are fit for military service now. And about 9% of that whole cohort is even willing to consider it. And so, you know, a lot of students come to college, I learned this as an administrator, on psychoactive medications, right? And how do you deploy to a combat zone if your medication might not, you know, show up? You can't really do that. So this is a real problem. Okay, I'm going to stop there so we can go on to our.
All right. So we're done here. So I spent most of my day in my office yesterday trying to figure out how I was going to say what I wanted to say without becoming the permanent resident of some federal holding cell, and it turns out I'm being recorded, so that's even better. So we'll see. I'll let you know in a week. So in my, for years in my intro courses, I used to end with the House Divided speech, and that seemed to make a lot of sense with me. For me at that time. In other words, I argued that our current situation was analogous in key ways to 1858, a house divided. I don't do this anymore, right? Primarily because I don't think it's 1858 anymore. If anything, we're far closer to 1860. On the other hand, again, no analogy is perfect, and I hate using them in the first place because there's always some wise guy undergrad in the seats that says, what about this? And it's not, okay, great, here we go. So now I got to spend the rest of the class qualifying my analogies and metaphors, and then it just doesn't work. But I'm up here, and it doesn't work that way in this format, so I'm just going to keep plowing ahead. And because at the same time, and I'll come back to this in a moment, I also see, I think, a number of decided similarities between our own situation and that of Spain in the 1930s, which is a terrifying thought. But if we think about that House Divided speech for just a moment, Lincoln begins that speech by saying, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. And if the virtue of statesmanship is prudence or practical wisdom, then the requirements of statesmanship at any given moment are defined by partially the first principles of justice, but also partially by the particular situation on the ground at that moment. And so it behooves us to think a little bit about what that is. And I'm thankful to Dr. Ray and Dr. Grant for covering some aspects of that, and I want to kick around a different one. Right? So what is the situation we find ourselves in the country at this moment? And I would posit, it's my hypothesis at this point, that we are in the midst of an active Marxist revolution. And I've read about them, but you know, undergrad me never imagined that I would be living through one. Right now, it's a slow motion one. Right, this isn't October 1917. Right, the Trotsky doesn't just simply get on, stand up in front of the newspapers and announce that the Kerensky government has fallen and it's all done. Right, so it's a slow motion revolution. Right, and this I think also. To circle back on the Spain thing for a moment, is where the analogy to the Spain of the 1930s is so helpful. Right? After the proclamation of the Spanish Republic, Spain's left did many of the things that our left is currently doing. The attempt to delegitimize and criminalize dissent overtly through simply the outlawing of political parties, the attempt to rig elections, which they engaged in the mid-1930s, and the attempt to overthrow the institutions of Spanish culture and civil society, most notably in that case, the Catholic Church. Right? And this last one's important because it illustrates to us that Marxist revolution can have both economic and non-economic manifestations. Right? So Orthodox Marxism focuses on the struggle for liberation of one economic class, the proletariat, against the other, the bourgeoisie. But Orthodox Marxism also relied on the existence of certain social and economic factors in order to work, notably the existence of a large, impoverished and oppressed class of industrial laborers who would constitute the revolutionary proletariat. But as a number of commentators have observed, Herbert Marcuse comes to mind. I use, in some of my classes, I use a speech by Gregory Calvert of the Students for Democratic Society where he makes the same point, that in Western societies like the United States, Orthodox Marxist, the sort of dialectical process was thwarted by the very prosperity of Western capitalist society. In other words, the proletariat became the middle class, right? And the middle class doesn't have any particular interest in overthrowing the system that lifted them out of poverty and into the middle class, right? So they end up becoming, right, a robust middle class in this sort of way of thinking about it. A robust middle class becomes a bulwark of the existing order, and so therefore a huge problem in the eyes of someone like Marcuse to revolution, right? And so the solution that these Marxists found is found in the work of people like, and this is a name that's been kicked around over the last few years a bit, the Italian Antonio Gramsci, right? Who posits that the institutions and norms of bourgeois society are a bulwark protecting that society, right? So you can't simply, right? Attempting to overthrow America the way you overthrow, the way the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist regime is a bit like charging into the machine guns, right? You have to wage a different kind of warfare against a regime like America's in order to destroy it. And so the solution was to destroy those institutions and norms, right? To break down civil society so that it doesn't support the existing order. And then that order will be ripe for overthrow. And that thus began what the German activist Rudi Dutschke called the Long March Through the Institutions. Right? So what do? Well, you corrupt institutions, private institutions like the churches and the Boy Scouts, public institutions like the schools, and even your library. For those of you that are local, you can have some fun with that. You infuse them with the ideologies of our time: critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, LGBT. Right. Another way to accomplish this is to cause the breakdown of civil society by encouraging lawlessness. so that people no longer believe the government will protect them, and that undermines people's attachment to the regime. So you refuse to arrest or prosecute criminals. You decriminalize actions like theft. Right? Stores are pulling out of places like Portland and San Francisco because they simply can't stop the bleeding and no one will help them. Bail reform, right? So the police arrest somebody and 3 hours later he's back on the street. Right? Flood the country with imported crime, right? And everything that comes with that. And it's even better when it's paired with systematic persecution of the law-abiding, right? Hence my concerns about winding up in a federal holding cell. The idea is that people will not only abandon hope that government will protect them, but view the existing order as a threat. Ultimately, though, the most comprehensive attack is on the family. Right? The family is a private sphere ultimately, which is a huge problem, whereby normal people, which is to say you and I, can communicate our values to our children in a way that is inaccessible to these ideological revolutionaries. So what do? You break that down, right? No-fault divorce, feminism, LGBT ideology, right? And this is what LGBT in schools is really all about. It's not about grooming. Grooming just comes along for the ride, right? It's to drive a wedge between children and their parents, right? To break down that bond and that link. Okay, so there's that. But the other phenomenon that we have to think about, I think, and this is something that both Dr. Grant and Dr. Ray have pointed out, so I'm just going to build on that a little bit, is how does this thesis about Marxist revolution square with the idea that the country is simultaneously transforming from a constitutional republic into an oligarchy? I mean, how do we, right? How do we square those things, right? And I think the answer is that, if not always, then it's frequently the case that Marxist revolution ends up serving the cause of some elite few, right? Lenin posits the existence of a vanguard, right? The same Calvert that I mentioned from the Students for Democratic Society says that the SDS and students in general will perform a similar function. They will be a kind of vanguard revolutionizing the American working class. Now, this was in the 1960s and 70s. There's a book that came out not too long ago, a few years ago, I guess now, by the British historian Orlando Figgis called The Whisperers. And the subtitle is Private Life in Stalin's Russia. And one of the points he makes in this book is that what the Bolshevik Revolution did, among other things, was simply to substitute one oligarchy, which is to say the Tsarist one, with another one, meaning the Bolshevik one. In other words, the Bolsheviks themselves became a new ruling class, right? And while the oligarchs of our own time, right, may not be committed and ideological Marxists, they are certainly content to use those people in order to secure their own hegemony, right? And so thinking about this, and I'm trying to be careful about my time here, helps us, I think, to start to think about the other part of that sentence from Lincoln's House Divided speech, which is the what to do and how to do it, right? And so if I can use another Lincoln example, right, Lincoln in his Lyceum speech saw reverence as the solution to the problem of his time, right? Reverence for the Constitution and the laws, reverence for the rapidly departing revolutionary generation who bequeathed us our, what he calls, political inheritance in that speech. And of course, conservatism naturally leans toward this reverence, right? The preservation of the old and the good, right? And the reason that I bring this up is because I saw a lot of, maybe this was more seeing it on social media, but I saw a number of people on the right, for instance, use the Lyceum speech as a kind of hammer to hit Trump supporters over the head with for January 6th, right? This is not Lincolnian. This is not the way Lincoln would act. We need to be linked, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine, right? But Lincoln's appeal to reverence in the Lyceum speech presupposed that mob rule threatened to break down a stable, Republican, constitutional regime that more or less protected the rights of the governed. In other words, that there was a functioning constitutional republic in place. Right? Our situation, however, is different. Those who would break down the regime occupy virtually all of the corridors of power, and not simply political, but corporate and cultural as well. And so, and they have, to a large degree, already accomplished that destructive task, so that the constitutional republic has already been subverted, and we live in a post-constitutional world. Right? In other words, the thing that we would preserve is already substantially destroyed. Right? So what is there, right? What is there to, in many ways, what is there to preserve? It's also the case that the character of Lincoln's audience was fundamentally different, as Dr. Grant pointed out, from an analogous American audience today. John Adams in 1798 said that the system that is created by the Constitution, he says, was created for a moral and a religious people, and that it is inadequate to the government of any other. Right? And if you take something in the last few years like COVID mania, what we found out there, again, among other things, was that there are millions of people in this country who are not only content to be ruled tyrannically, but want to be ruled tyrannically. Right? In other words, that prickly "don't tread on me" spirit is absent from millions of our fellow citizens. And in fact, they wear their submission as a badge of honor. It's proof of their virtue, it's proof of their intelligence, of their commitment to science, right? And all of those things. Okay, so given that situation, and I think I only have about 2 minutes left, but what is the statesmanship of the future going to have to look like? Right? And I would suggest that instead of being conservative, the first qualification of a statesmanship of the future is that it's going to have to be counter-revolutionary. Right? If we are in the midst of a revolution, then what we need is not to conserve, right? But to destroy that revolution, right? So conservatives want to conserve, but what we would conserve has already been largely wrecked. Right? So what is necessary then is to wreck those who would wreck the country. Right, who would do such a thing, right? A promising example, and this was something I took a lot of interest in a few weeks ago, was what's happening, what DeSantis did with the new college in Florida, which is to say, go into a place and strip away their sinecures, deprive them of their positions, right? Drive them out. In other words, do to them what they would do to us. And this has to be done across the board, right? Their activities, right? What they would do in the schools and the library, that has to be criminalized and then enforced, right? So that they can't do it. Now, look, don't take this the wrong way. This does not mean I don't have a DeSantis bumper sticker on my car, and I've written something recently about my concerns of the limitations of DeSantis. All right. So on the one hand, it has to be counter-revolutionary. On the other hand, it has to be reconstructive. Right? I wondered for a long time what's meant by the term reconstruction, and Frederick Douglass has a great essay where he talks about this. He says what it means is that we have to reconstruct republicanism, and not just the forms of it, out of the ashes of Southern oligarchy after the Civil War. And in the particular context, that meant convincing these people, showing them that the thing they thought was their blessing, slavery, was in fact their curse. Right? So we need to do the same thing in our own time. Right? We have to rebuild the character of our people, and I have no idea where to begin. Right? The enormity of that is staggering. Right? But what we have to acknowledge, if I can go back and end with a Lincoln because I'm out of time, is what Lincoln said, and I'll just end with this in his second inaugural address. Excuse me, not a second inaugural address, his second annual message to Congress. I can't read my own notes. This is what I get for trying to write things. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country.
right. Thank you all for being here. I know Dr. Ray said age before beauty. My wife would object to me going last then, but she's not here. So again, I appreciate the chance to see so many familiar faces and hear the good you're doing. The panel, for those who weren't here, of the alum was excellent. It was very encouraging and very good to see and get an idea of how things are going. And to remember the first 10 years of this program through their eyes and to therefore think beyond it. Now, by name, we are a school of statesmanship. So this panel's topic asks about the possibility for that. And therefore, the term statesmanship in our title defines or helps to define the good we seek, the study of principle for its practical use. But the school itself serves an essential function in the title too. It's not just statesmanship, it's a school of statesmanship. That declares our role in achieving this good, our practical aim, so to speak. We are conceived for teaching and learning. It thus dedicates us to the task of education at a broader institution, Hillsdale so conceived and so dedicated. So I want to focus on that task in 3 ways and how it might relate to the prospects of statesmanship. The challenges we face in it in particular, the possibilities we possess, and then for reason for celebration that I think we see. So the challenges first. This audience needs little convincing that many challenges confront our system of education generally. Some of those have been alluded to. We can, I think, call them crises without being alarmist. One has to be careful in that because just as we have what, I'm sure Dr. Grant knows this, 37 or 42 states of emergency, technically, legally speaking, so we have about 500 left and right if you pay attention to our public discourse. But I think, but we can discuss these under 2 broad headings. So maybe this is a little bit of Dr. Porteous's Where Are We? First, we talk, is the thing I think we talk about most here, which is I'd call a crisis of purpose. And this includes a crisis of content, a rejection of truth, and that rejection is one of 2 ways, broadly speaking, either in the pursuit of a kind of relativism, a kind of self-actualization grounded in self-definition. For those in my con law class, we've talked about Justice Kennedy's contributions to that idea. Or I would say maybe even more dominant now, one that's not relativistic, but just false and harmful, that has a false anthropology, is itself, you could say, a false religion. Examples, this came up in the alumni panel about the 1619 Project and its distortions of American history in the service of current progressive tropes. The intrusion of views of human biology and sexuality that deify one's subjective psychology over the time-tested dictates of reason, revelation, and natural law. So I think we're fairly aware of those and how they manifest. I would say that going along with it is a crisis of approach, that paired with this is education as indoctrination. And this kind of indoctrination comes from a combination of militancy, fear, and desperation. A militancy that those who purvey this must create conformity or they fail. Fear that defines their opposition, in this case usually the right, as inherently evil, and therefore there's an ignorance to their understanding. And then a kind of desperation in how they view education as basically a war room. And I think what that does wrong is it actually does a disservice even to their own attempts. It creates parrots, I mean the animal, not thinkers or moral reasoners. It demands unswerving fealty, not self-governing citizens, and it pillages the past only to serve present political screeds. The thing I was so encouraged by on the alumni panel is how much they said they learned here to read text carefully and on their own terms. I don't think that this kind of education that I think is part of our problem thinks that way, approaches that way. Second, I would say we face, and this is not talked about quite as much, a crisis of institutional survival. And some of this is political. The threats from antagonistic governments, threatening tax-exempt statuses, threatening accreditation. But I'd say right now, many more colleges are on the brink of collapse financially, dropping donations, dropping admissions, and I would say, I was talking with someone about this before, the dropping admissions is only going to get worse, and it's not merely politics. You've got the birth dearth that happened in the Great Recession that is about to hit, and that's going to destroy a lot of good schools and good institutions. And I'd say the other is the moving away, and this isn't bad necessarily, from acquiring college degrees for employment to the degree it's been done, which, by the way, the governor of Pennsylvania, for example, removing all requirements for a college education for government jobs in Pennsylvania. So a number of colleges already have or are imminently going to collapse. And again, we may revel in that, institutions getting their just desserts, but if our mission is here to succeed, we need friends. And a number of these schools in danger or going under are either real or potential friends. If you've read about the King's College in Manhattan, or Trinity College in Illinois going entirely online, which seems to be on its way out, or Marymount in Virginia, or the College of St. Benedict and St. John's, those with at least a historical religious mission, cutting degrees like theology, right? All in the name of, they're saying, financial survivability. Now, with that challenge, I do think comes real possibility. Going back to the financial and enrollment crises, and I would add to it the aftermath and reaction to COVID policies in education, that the educational landscape is breaking up in a way more fundamental than seen in generations. And that does create a space unheard of, I think, in education for reformation and reconstitution. Because it's not merely a battle of ideas, it's a battle of structuring. And this is certainly true at the college level as these things come home to roost, but it's also true at the K-12 level, especially, as I would say, in the aftermath of COVID and other things. And so we do have the chance, and I think much more of a chance than previously, to build new institutions, to reform old ones, and together, putting those things together, build new and renewed systems of education. And we must be ready for that. And we must be ready with a clear conception of education's purpose. Again, I was so encouraged by the faculty not the faculty panel, that's us. I'm sure you're really encouraged by what we've been saying so far. Yeah, but the alumni panel was so encouraging because it really articulated, I think, the things we're trying to do here. Education of the whole person as a reasoning being, a moral being, an embodied being. Education of the political person, that we are political and thus intrinsically concerned with justice. That we are citizens of a particular regime, and that this regime in its foundations is good, and thus worth explaining, and thus worth defending. And that we also need to be ready with a clear conception of education's approach, again, something I was encouraged by the other panel, to ourselves not create parrots, that we, to steal a Joe Biden phrase, build back better, right? Not just different than the current approach. With this focus on the great text, with this focus on the goods of our country. And this requires, by the way, having the patience to teach these eternal things, even if the results aren't immediate, even if good results aren't uniform, and the courage to teach them on their own terms, not merely their most convenient ways of being used for the latest news cycle. And again, very encouraged by what the alumni panel said on that score, that is what they say they were taught here, that were built and educated in a way to really get at those things. And of course, none of this ignores the connection of education to statesmanship. Quite the contrary. It's about preparing people to go out and do the kinds of things that you all in this audience either are doing or are preparing to do. And therefore, I would end with the idea that of a celebration. And As you can maybe tell, academics, we aren't usually that great at celebrating. We tend to be critics by training, right? And maybe by disposition. And I'm not saying there isn't plenty of reason and support to have that kind of disposition or perspective, but today is a celebration. The School of Statesmanship has been at this task for a decade now, and that is quite an accomplishment. You all, we all, should be proud of what has been done and is being done, the work that is being done at this college, in scholarship, in the classroom, and the work that's being done by those coming from here in the academy, in K-12 education, journalism, policy, and more. You're doing very good work, and I don't think that it is not without its effect on our current state. And with that celebration, I think we should feel gratitude. It is an immense privilege to do what we do here, to study what we study, to teach and to learn. A thing that I hope I never lose is the wonder of the fact that this is what I get to do for a living, and the wonder that there still are places that study the things we study and look at the things we do and see them as goods in themselves. And so let our gratitude, I would say, instill humility rather than hubris, determination rather than reticence, and wonder again rather than presumption. And I'll build off Lincoln as well. He asked in his Gettysburg Address whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. And we are, of course, asking that of our country. I would say that we as an educational institution are part of that answer, and we must ask a similar question of ourselves. Can we, conceived as we are, dedicated as we are, long endure? I would say let us celebrate that we have endured this far, and let us rededicate ourselves to our task today and tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Okay, so that turned out to be a good order, from the cynicism of age to the hopefulness of youth. That worked out very well by accident. So we're just going to open it up and give you guys a chance to ask the faculty whatever you wish, within certain bounds of reason, of course. So we have the mics on either side, and I'll put on Bruce's hat, speak into the microphone, I guess, is what I'm supposed to say. So, Dan Bieber. Yep.
First, thanks, gentlemen, for speaking. It's great to be back here and hear from you guys again. Question for the entire panel or anybody looking to answer the question. We all just heard that it's very much like the problems that statesmen are going to face is a multi-front fight. And I'm wondering if any of you could put, of the various issues you touched on in what you said, is if there's anything in terms of priority or task management that would be involved in, moving the ball forward or starting the counter-revolution. As like, if you had the ear of a prospective statesman that only has, so much time, so much manpower, so much support, so much bandwidth, what would you tell them to focus on first? Like the thing where we really need to stop the bleeding and walk back from where we are today. Thanks.
I'll start. I would tell them to get a copy of Kevin Porteous's talk and read it. And I say that because the problems are now so great that's what's required is a kind of radicalism. And by radicalism, what I mean is a return to the roots and sort of confronting the thing directly. And I have no idea whether Ron DeSantis has these qualities, but Dr. Porteous mentioned what he's doing at New College, and that really is the model for what has to be done. There has to be a kind of purging. The radicals have to be moved out of positions of responsibility. He's done so much better than I expected that I have a little bit of hope there. But the scale and scope of it is enormous. In other words, our economic system is in a real crisis. And it isn't going to go away without something radical being done. The federal bureaucracy dominating everything. That's very much tied up with passivity on the part of the United States Congress. They like not being responsible. Makes it easier to get reelected. That's why I say what's required is a political party. A political party that says, we're reversing all this. That's not easy to do.
I mean, boy, it's a target-rich environment. What do you? There are so many problems, as Dr. Ray was just saying. But I think the single greatest problem right now is immigration. And if we don't do something about that, I mean, you have problems ranging from you can't win elections because you've elected a new people in that phrase, to the misery caused by the economic dislocation, misery caused by what I keep thinking of as being unhomed. You know, I think of my stunned parents evicted from their church. It's become a Spanish-speaking church in a town where, when I grew up, a town of 120,000, I never met a Hispanic person. Graduated from high school in 1989, and all of a sudden they're literally being told, you need to leave because they don't speak Spanish, and you know, and you talk to people, and this happens all the time. It's not just about speaking Spanish either. So without that, I don't see how, you know, and you can see these studies in terms of elections of, yeah, if we had the demographics that Reagan had in 1984, you know, Trump winning 48 states in an election in 2020, you know, and people, well, you just have to have California, you know, it's like that has to be what didn't used to be. So anyway.
Yeah, I use their time in order to shield myself and try and think of something, but I can't see. I'm looking around the podium here. Yeah, I mean, Dr. Grant mentioned it in passing. In the very short term, if you want something right now, you've got to fix the elections, right? If you can't win an election, none of it matters, right? None of these other things matter at all, and you can see what happens. And I keep coming, you know, we end up coming back to this example, the Florida example. But you know, I have no doubt that some of the increase in DeSantis's victory margin in Florida between 2018 and 2022 had to do with his success or popularity, but some of it had to do with the simple fact that he and his predecessor did a lot of work to at least restore a semblance of order to their election system. I mean, you know, if you're old enough, Broward County, Florida had been an election cesspool for decades. And I'm not saying they fixed it, but the margin of corruption is now reduced within reasonable bounds, it seems. And so the margin of victory went from 4 points to 19 points, right, in one 4-year cycle. So,
I guess I would just say very quickly, yeah, to what degree are politicians willing to, and the American people willing to spend political capital on structural change? Education, again, are you willing to, is New College going to be, for example, a model, or is it going to be a nice PR thing that got you good point? Because building an education system is actually going to be hard, long work that a lot of right-wing voters are going to get bored with if we're not careful, right? And so making sure that you're willing to do that. And then I would say, are we willing structurally to work on separation of powers and to not just be mad at bureaucrats, but what structural changes would we do? And that has to go beyond, we'll fire all the bureaucrats. Well, no, how do you actually restructure it so that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches are doing their thing? And part of that question would be, how big can a government be that Congress can legislate for? And are the American people willing to have a government of that size and scope? Or is what they want as far as government goods and services demanding a kind of administration that they then say they don't like? So I think educating and presenting that kind of choice and hopefully getting the American people to make the right choice in that question, I think those are two structural changes that then present the capacity to then have the policy debates and principled debates within a system that actually could function and work.
My question is similar. For the successful statesmen of the right today, what sort of primacy does fighting the culture wars have, and how is that best accomplished?
I'll start again, being aged. It has been the policy of Republicans to try to dodge the cultural wars. They want to take advantage of it to get votes. They don't want to do anything about it. And that's been the game all along. And it extends very deeply into the conservative movement. There's a problem with that. You lose the cultural war, you lose absolutely everything. Kevin Porteous mentioned the attack on the family. You cannot sustain a Republican government without a Republican people. That Republican people has to be formed by stable families. An attack on the family is an attack on the republic. But those Republicans and those conservatives who want to dodge the cultural wars are willing to step back and watch that attack on the family go all the way through. People are beginning to see that now. You know, you're having battles over the public schools. You've had the FBI directed by the president to investigate parents who seem to want to have some sort of say or at least knowledge about what's going on in the classrooms where their children are being educated. And a lot of parents are up in arms. There ought to be more parents up in arms. If this counter-revolution is to take place, it might very well start with school board elections. As I said, it can't be just one guy. It's got to be a party. And the Republican Party, as it currently exists, doesn't care at all about this.
Yeah, I think fighting the culture wars smart, intelligently, what you pick to fight. And I think it's right to say that parental rights relating to their children and to education is something that you can actually enlist, not just an online army, but an actual real army out there of people that aren't themselves watching politics every day, but can immediately see why this is dangerous, why this is an undermining of their own lives, not just an abstraction. And so I think starting with those kind of things in a smart way is part of what matters here.
Since Dr. Ray and Dr. Carrington both talked about schools, I'm gonna rant about that for just a second, because I think that that's more than any place else, that's where that fight is going to take place. And it is the case that most people on our side, including most of us here in this room, have abandoned that, which is to say that the current attitude of most educated conservatives is to say, I'm going to withdraw from that field altogether, and the hell with that, I'm leaving it to them, right? And what we're in effect doing is saving our children at the expense of our grandchildren, right? The reality is that no matter what we do, the vast majority of the future citizens of this country are going to be educated in public schools, right? And so at the same time that we educate our kids at home, we abandon that to them, right? We virtually guarantee our own defeat in the long run because we have no interest in regaining control over these institutions, right? In pushing back, right? So that plumber in Fairfax County that got himself arrested has done, I think, in his way, more to affect the future trajectory of the country than most, if not all of us, right, in that way, because he's directly attempting to fight back against this, right, in a very public way. And so, yeah, we cannot we cannot simply abandon that to them, right? Whatever we're doing in the short run with our own children. So, yeah.
I don't have much to add. It was all great comments. We need to toughen up. I mean, if this is going to win, that's what I'm, this, I think, follows from what my colleagues are saying here. Surrender, surrender, surrender. I'm 52 years old, and my entire life has been watching conservatives surrender. So, every once in a while, they'll take kind of a half-baked stand, and they'll bear some temporary fruit. And you've got to be nice, meaning play by the left's rules is a way to death and destruction. What you're being mean, and there's always, anytime someone tries to take a stand, you'll have a bunch of so-called conservatives saying, actually, that's unchristian, you're really mean, you're bad, and that has to be overcome if we're going to make headway on these, which I think we have to on these issues.
Yeah, my question is about the institutions, and I'll even include Hillsdale College as an institution, because we are one. We have buildings, there are salaries, there are officers, there's a charter, there's a board, and so as we talk about the decline of American institutions, it's hard to imagine the college wouldn't be affected by that potential decline, and that raises a kind of very serious point for those of us who have benefited greatly from the existence of the school about its future as an institution within the conservative orbit. I go back to 2015. In the spring, when I was working at Heritage, everyone thought the election was going to be between Bush versus Clinton. And it turned out that was not what was going to happen. And Donald Trump, a man who had really no institutional background within America's political parties, became president through this sort of meteoric and seismic political event. So I guess I just want to pose the question about the future of the college. I mean, in the nature of these crises, what is the role of liberal education for our students in the study of statesmanship, and the kinds of statesmen that could be produced? What is our role in advising and helping them? Can we even do that in our own capacity right now when the regime is so unstable? So again, maybe the question is, in 10 years when we come back, what will the future of the college be within the regime as these changes are occurring?
Let me say a little bit. Everything that's happened so far has helped this college. Donations have come in because things are so bad elsewhere. Early on, when I came here 15 years ago, Dr. Arndt, at one point, someone said, "What's so good about Hillsdale?" And he said, "Our competitors." We have profited greatly. We have a faculty full of refugees from other institutions. It's almost as if it's like the 1930s and the early 1940s when very distinguished people from Europe ended up in American universities and improved them immensely. That's happened here. The future's dark, though, because they will come after us. They'll do it by way of accreditation. The government of Michigan is not friendly now, not any part of that government. So who knows what will happen in that way. At some point, there will be a great struggle over the survival of this institution as a liberal arts institution where people are allowed to argue and where one samples the different arguments as opposed to where one undergoes indoctrination in the latest fashion.
Yeah, I think we'll continue to be successful if we stay faithful. And as I was saying a moment ago, it's going to be a fight. As Paul was just in there, at some point there will be a fight, and there's many skirmishes that already happen in this sort of, you think of it in a sort of military way, and at some point there will be a big battle. And I'm reminded of a line from Tolkien about, speaking of fighting, Mordor, treachery has always been our greatest enemy. It's a line at one point. That's with many conservative institutions. They expect the attack from the outside, which does happen sometimes, but then it turns out it's people on the inside burrowing away to change things would be a very great danger, and it will require toughness it'll be an actual fight, and people will have to stand up and do what is right then, stick to our mission.
When I was first here, also about 15 years ago, I remember the Collegian did a survey of faculty. And of course, it's oversimplified, but what is your political self-identification? And it was almost exactly evenly divided into thirds between conservative, I can talk, libertarian, and liberal. Right, and so even then, right, Dr. Grant talks about, right, treachery has been our greatest enemy, right? Do not suppose that the institution is monolithic, that everyone's on the same page, right? And that's really important, right? I mean, curriculum is great, and that's terrific, but I think we all know that in any institution, personnel is policy, right? Who you put in positions is ultimately what matters, and it trumps everything else. So,
yeah, and I would just say, continue to have confidence in what we do, to assert it, and to do it internally, and that does include taking a stand on the idea that there's a reason we have the statues out there that we do, and not others. That we do think that this American experiment in self-government is superior, is the best, and why. But at the same time is to have the confidence in those principles to not cut corners in teaching them, to demand a kind of excellence, to demand a reading of the whole corpus of the Western heritage, even the things we don't like, to sometimes say that people we do like don't maybe say everything we'd like them to say the way we'd like them to say it, and that still doesn't make them not worth reading and not reading on their own terms, and that we have the confidence in our own principles to do that and still not waver in our own commitments. And so I think that that's going to be the temptation too, is going to be to cut corners, not just to fight the battle against direct enemies, but undermine our own selves in those ways as well. And I'm not saying I think I see that. I'm saying that I think that would be a temptation.
Very practical question for the whole panel. Dr. Ray has already partially touched on this, but I'd value all of your thoughts. To the extent that you're willing to tie yourself down to something so specific, is Donald Trump capable of leading Republicans to a meaningful victory in 2024? And just generally, how should conservatives be thinking strategically about that coming election?
I'll throw the cat among the pigeons. Not a chance. All he'll want is vindication. And if you look at his first administration, the people he appoints will be no good. He won't focus. And he really doesn't care very much about the things we care about. He cares about his own vindication. I understand the desire for vindication. He was more sinned against than sinning. But no. The other thing is, he's not a man who can lead a party. And you've got to have someone who can rally a party. Dr. Pistrito will come to his defense.
Yes. Oh, he doesn't have it. Here, you can have my microphone.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Yeah.
But he is paying for this microphone.
Well, I mean, either.
Oh.
Right. It seems at this point, I have no idea. I think that's a lot. I think that's a lot harder to say. And I think that I think that my opinion of Trump is a little less cynical. There were far easier ways for him to gratify his various desires than by embarking on the course that he did. And so now either way, right? As things are progressing at this point, we're going to find out. Right? All of the data indicates that the nomination is his if he wants it. And so Republicans, whether they like it or not, are going to have to get used to the idea that he's the nominee, because he's going to be the nominee. So now, and again, I don't think that's right altogether a bad thing. I'll also push back on the appointments thing, right? And it seems to me, and I don't think this is a thought original to me, that Trump's position in 2017 was in some ways analogous to, say, Grant's position when he arrived in Washington in 1869, which is to say an outsider who didn't know a lot of people and had to rely in a lot of ways on an establishment to help him fill his administration. And that created a lot of problems for him. But I would suggest that it seems to me, and it seems impossible that he wouldn't have learned something from that, and also culled through some of that with those people at this point, right? So that by the time he was done, he had managed to weed out at least some of the Rex Tillersons. Remember Rex Tillerson? Yeah. No, okay. But as I understand it, and maybe Dr. Grant, maybe you know more about this than I do, or Dr. Ray, where did that name come from as a Secretary of State? And my understanding is it came from, was it Condoleezza Rice? That was her idea.
Bob Gates.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so the usual crew of stooges on the right, and so. But he seems to have, to a much greater degree, figured out that that those people are problematic, and so, yeah, I'll stop there.
I don't know. Michael Cohen and Omarosa and some of those guys were establishment types, and were immediately then declared traitors when they didn't pan out. So I don't know. Some of these arguments seem to say that the defense of Donald Trump is how his inability to change anything, his weakness, an argument from weakness, which doesn't seem to me a great argument to say try it again.
Yeah, I in a way, I don't want Trump to win because I want to see what people cope when they get. First off, the idea that Ron DeSantis is going to win the blue wall states to me is risible. I mean, it's not going to happen in a billion years. But okay, and he's the best of the other candidates. That's the. But plummeting in the polls this past week, he's running most polls 28 points behind Trump. Some interesting things there, but. Trump had a lot of failures in his term in office, and I'd like to see somebody try and do better against the whole world against him, you might say, including the people who are supposed to be helping him. And whatever we want to say about his appointments, I'm pretty certain those people were all telling Trump, I will help you. I want to help you do this, and then nonstop. So, you have generals now lying, admitting, boasting about how they lied to Trump about what they were doing. And generals still holding their positions, right? And so we're not really reckoning with, I don't think, how's anybody going to get control of our security services? When the Whitmer Fednapping thing happened, my students, I said, I'm going to tell you right now, half of the people they're charging are FBI agents or informants. 2 months later, I had to come back and apologize because it was 2/3. And now it's turning out of the J6 stuff, once the footage was released, that a ton of those people were FBI, other DOJ, DC Metro Police, including people encouraging, illegal activity, right? How do you, getting control of that? That's going to be a real feat. That would require the type of human being that a Machiavelli or Plutarch would write about approvingly. And let's see if we can find that. So yeah, I'm happy. I could list a lot of Trump's defects and my disappointments with that, but that situation was Nixon on steroids, and who they did get rid of Nixon too, right? It ruined him. And they came after him harder, the most investigated man in human history, I think it's safe to say. And it's odd that Democrats seem to think Trump is a threat because they're not, pay attention to your enemies, right? Who are they constantly going after and trying to come up with fake, ridiculous charges? Another one just imploded this week, right? So it's kind of interesting. That's still going on, so anyway.
And don't think they won't do to DeSantis what they did to Trump. The idea that anyone's immune to that is also risible. So.
Let me add one other thing, and I'm the one to add it since this is a mere child compared to me. I'm 74, he's 52. As Aristotle puts it, there's an old age of the mind as well as of the body.
Okay, so Ben's going to have the last question.
All right. So my question has to do with the statesmanship of accelerated decline. I've heard some conservatives argue that the only way out is through, and by that I mean actually accelerating the decline of America. There's really no way to claw our way back. And
well, in that case, we're on the right track.
yeah, and so, as long as Americans are as comfortable and as wealthy and as powerful as we are, we'll never just face the kind of existential necessity we need to make the difficult and painful decisions we have to make. And of course, the problem with this is, as Adam Smith says, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. America is still so powerful that we could do a lot of damage. It could take a long time. So what's the possibility of a statesmanship of accelerated decline?
That would be a disaster from which there'd be no coming back.
I'm not quite familiar with this, so I'll have to say, because it sounds to me like we should hope for as much pain, destruction for our fellow Americans as possible so that they flip out, and that flip out could be a positive change. Is that?
Well, an example would be like, say the fiscal system. Like, you'd hope that the currency would collapse and we would actually lose our status as the world's reserve currency to force us to actually balance our budget and so forth, something like that. I mean, no one wants it, but no one's also balancing the budget or reining in spending.
I don't know why anybody thinks it wouldn't just make everything worse. Like, that's what I can't get about. I see these arguments online all the time, and Dr. Porteous mentioned Spain in the 1930s. They did the accelerated decline, and the events in Russia in 1917, the various that was accelerated decline, and what everybody in Russia knew, who was a member of the intelligentsia, was everything will be better if we get rid of the Tsar. And if that means some violence, and it turned out most of those people wound up dying in a Siberian logging camp or with a bullet in the back of their head. But so, yeah, I'm really reluctant to do that. And everybody seems to think it won't affect them, or if they have enough canned goods and ammunition, they'll be good. And I just think of how, look, this place, people panicked when we had an ice storm a couple weeks ago. For a couple days of power being out. I didn't like that, by the way. Well, I had students literally fleeing the area as if there was a bomb had gone off or something. And but really talking is some kind of societal breakdown, civil disorder, and that really would be horrible. And I'm all for being exercising Second Amendment rights and being prepared for problem, but I can't say I wish it. I think that could very well make the situation. The political version of this is, let's have a convention of states and redo the Constitution. And I keep thinking that means trans rights in the Constitution. Would anybody think that would give us a better result than we have now? I cannot imagine. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, what I think both of their comments point to is the limitations that we have individually and collectively in terms of our ability to control events, right? That is to say, you set in motion forces, right, thinking you're going to have a particular outcome, and think about how few revolutions turn out the way they're supposed to turn out, right? I mean, we think about our own, and the people who started it and the ideas that gave it life were more or less still there at the end, but that's rare. And so, You know, once you blow something up, you have no idea how people are going to react. You have no idea what the unintended consequences are going to be, right? You just, there's so much of it, there's so little of it that's within our control, that you're unleashing forces thinking they're going to do one thing and they generally don't.
Yeah, that's, I know Dr. Ray does work on Montesquieu, and I'm teaching a class on Montesquieu in the fall to pitch to the current grad students. But one thing that I think he is very wise on is constantly reminding people that one must not think about merely intended but unintended consequences of actions, especially the more extreme, the more debilitating, or the more destructive. The more so one has to consider that sometimes an attempt to do good, even a minor attempt to, an attempt to do a great good may involve actually the revolution eating you. So I think that is something that we probably should not hope for, despite understanding the idea that, oh, this is the way to achieve the counter-revolution. I mean, a lot of the American founding is about trying to set up structures of decision-making where our most rational, reasonable version of ourselves is doing so, not convinced that that's creating those kind of conditions.
Okay, join me in thanking the panelists. So I believe our reception formally commences at 5:30. I think that means that's when the bar opens. But soon enough anyway. So we'll see you all over there in due course. Thank you.